My name is Judy McKinney Thomas, and the McKinney family has been actively involved in the cemetery since the 1800s. I am the director of the cemetery and also the chair of the board and a member of the Cemetery Association. Probably for the last at least 50 years, there's been a McKinney involved in the upkeep and the record keeping of the cemetery, and it's kind of an inherited position. I got it from my aunt, Betty McKinney, and she had gotten it previously from my mother, and then my mother and daddy. Anyway, it's just gone on. And our daughter, bless her heart, Sonny Posey, knows that it will fall her lot to do this when I can no longer do it. Of course, we have the support of a board, a wonderful board of directors, and our spouses are good to help us with things up here. We've been trying to do some restoration and keeping the cemetery in a presentable manner. It's a very special place to so many people that we want to try to preserve it as best we can. The cemetery itself was actually started in 1851. A.B. Hughes had come here as one of the early settlers, kind of the second wave that came here, and he had donated the property because he realized that the community was going to need a place to bury the folks here. Prior to that, most folks had what they call family plots. They would bury their dead on their own property. But as the community grew, there just was a need for something else. And kind of, I think the thing that really prompted it to happen was a gentleman came through the Rocky Mount community on horseback and unfortunately fell very ill and collapsed from his horse in front of Hughes' store. And there was nothing they could do for him, and the gentleman died with absolutely, back then you didn't have driver's license and social security cards. He had no identification. They had no way to get in touch with the next of kin, so they needed a place for him to be buried. He was actually the first person buried in this cemetery. We do not know where he is buried because it is an unmarked grave. He is probably among the 228 that we know are buried here, but they do not have a name or a marker.
To us now, we're very populated centers in the 19th century, and so it's population displacement that moves people away, and there's no one sometimes left to take care of these places. So I think that's a really important point, that this community is obviously benefiting from someone who's dedicated to preserving, and I don't mean just preserving the history, I'm talking about preserving the integrity of a burial ground, which is a sacred place. So that's a pretty high call, I think, on anybody.
But it's something that you do because you love the
Absolutely.
place. It's my passion. My family is here, and to be able to bring these headstones basically back to life, to take them from this algae and dark look to something that's beautiful and white, and that you can read the inscriptions and know who's resting here. I just think it is such an important part of the cemetery, is to try to do as much restoration and preservation that we can, and that's the main focus that we have right now. We've got the documentation. We know who's buried here. We know a good bit about them. But now we want to bring these back to life and make them look like they did when they were put in here. And a lot of these still have that potential.
I think we're all stewards of the story, and that's what you have when you come into a cemetery, is you have a very rich story of a people that came before. And so for people to step up and take care of that, knowing that they're going to hand it on to someone else who will pick up the charge to do that. I mean, you're putting a lot of faith in the people who come after you, that will continue this. But this is literally a story ground. You can tell the story of the life of this entire community just walking through here, knowing what you know about every person here.
Back in the 1830s, there were a couple of families that came and built log cabins here. They really didn't do much more than that. When things really began to change here were when The Dalrymples, the Ellisons, the Adgers came here directly from Ireland. And they kind of really started the Rocky Mount community. They cleared land, had timber, and really began to build some structures and all here. And they are also some of the first people that were buried here in the cemetery. The second wave of people that came through were the Hughes, A.B. Hughes and James Hughes. They were brothers. They were the businessmen. They were the ones that actually came in, built the mercantile store, built a blacksmith shop, built a sawmill. So there was just vast forest here. They first cut the timber, and then after the land had been clear cut, they would start raising cattle. So that was what the Hughes, that's how they started off here. And then after the Hughes, that was the 1850s and that time period. The next wave of settlers that came in were from Barber County, Alabama. And there were 5 families that lived in close proximity to each other, and they formed a wagon train. And I think they must have, the day the war ended and those men came home, they loaded up their wives, their children, and their belongings, and they headed west. Headed here with a purpose of settling here in this area. The land over there, for number one, the land over in Alabama had been worn out by cotton. Cotton depletes the soil. They didn't have the fertilizers and the modern stuff that we have now. So they were looking for a place to farm, and they were looking for a new life. They had been through the war. They were ready to move on. So they loaded up their wives, their children, their belongings, and they came to this community. The purpose of their leaving was to come to Rocky Mount. Well, they were the farmers. So when they got here, their job was to clear the stumps and farm the land. So that's where we got the farming started up here. So we went from the timber and cattle business then to the farming business. So that's kind of basically, if you look through the cemetery and if you look at the records on this cemetery, I would estimate that 90% of the people that are buried here are direct descendants of those 11 families that from the 1830s to the mid-1860s settled this community, and that's most of who's buried here. My great-great-grandfather was Andrew Jackson McKinney, who was on that original wagon train from Barber County, Alabama, that they left there in 1865 and came here, and he is buried here, and that's kind of where it all started for my family. Old headstones that had the Masonic emblems on it. So obviously there was a active organization here in the Rocky Mount community for them. But this is A.B. Hughes, and like I say, he and his brother James, James is over there, could be attributed to doing the most for the community as far as business-wise, civic duty-wise, that type of thing, and church-wise, because he was very much a part of the establishment of the church here. Is Marjorie Gladney, and she died. She is actually the first recorded burial here. She died in 1853. We know the man that rode through on horseback was actually the first person buried here, but she was the actual first recorded. She was 36 when she died. The Adgers and the Belchers, and some of the McKinneys even, decided that farming was too hard here. So they left this area and went to the river bottoms up around Belcher. So we have Belchers, and the Adgers were up there, the McKinneys, some of the McKinneys went up there. Several of the families from this area relocated to that area, North Caddo Parish, from here. They settled here originally and then moved because the farming was better up there with the river bottoms and all. This is the grave of William Thomas Crawford. He was a captain in the Confederate Army, and he and his wife and children had come here from the Carolinas and had bought property, built a home, and were making their home here. At 30 years of age, he was killed in the war. And his wife and children had young children, knew they couldn't make it here. She couldn't make it on her own, so she loaded up her children and her belongings, and she went back to South Carolina, where they had come from. Well, Mr. Gilmer, who was the owner of the Smith-Gilmer plantation, bought her property from her so that, she would have money to get back home. Well, in 1865, that's when the wagon train with the McKinneys and all those people came over. Well, my family, the McKinney family, fell in love with the land that the Crawfords had, and it already had a home on it. The problem was they didn't have the money to buy it. So they lived in a little cabin not far from it for 3 years and saved their money. They were very frugal. There's other stories I could tell you about that. They said he even brought his own fire from Alabama. He was so tight. But anyway, they bought the Crawford place. And that was where my great-great-grandfather raised his family. And the house is, my sister owns the property where the house is located, and it's still standing somewhat. But it was built in the 1850s. And anyway, that's just kind of a sidebar on the Crawfords. But so sad, he was only 30 and left. And on the back side of this headstone is a memorial. This is a memorial to his brother Richard, who was killed at Gettysburg in 1863. The Confederate troops were kind of gathered in this area waiting to be processed out. And the weather had turned rather bad, and the men did not have a real good place to get in out of the weather, so they had gathered here at the church, and there were a group of them inside the church, but there were 4 of them that decided that they were going to sit out on the porch that was covered and play poker. Well, about that time, this storm intensified, and a bolt of lightning came down and struck the area where they were and killed the soldiers. So I guess the moral to the story is, don't be gambling on the church steps. The first church established here was the Concord Methodist Church, and it was further down off of 160 on Fire Tower Road, down in that area. It was established a year before this church. This church was second, and then New Bethel Baptist was the last church established. All within the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, they were established. Well, when you have a small community like this, and most everyone is a member of one of those 3 churches, that's where all the social events occurred, was at church. It was a place where the community gathered, where the church members gathered, where the young people gathered, where they met their future husbands and wives. It was just the way it was, and that's why we have so much intermarriage up here among the families, is because that was their social outlet. They didn't have a car. They couldn't go to Shreveport. They couldn't go. Plain dealing didn't exist. It came after the railroad came through in 1888. When the railroad bypassed Rocky Mount, A.B. Hughes, who was the primary businessman here at that time, relocated his business down to the railroad, which is called Hughes Spur. If you came 160, where you crossed the railroad track, that's known as Hughes Spur. There was no money in farming. Right. It was hard. Well, then you throw the Depression in, and even if you were farming, you did well. My grandfather talks about he would go to the bank and borrow $200, and with that $200, he would put all of his crops in. He would buy his staples for the year, or have enough money to where he could buy staples along. And then at the end of the farming season, he would go to the bank, pay the $200 back, have enough money to buy clothes for the children and a few necessities, and then turn right around at planting season and borrow another $200. That's, people just existed, particularly during the 30s when things were 20s and 30s when things were really difficult out here. And then the war came, the World War II, and that's when the young people left.
Probably heard this one. Koi metromania. Koi metromania comes from the Latin root koi, which is a burial ground, and koi metromania is an abnormal attraction or love of cemeteries. And I think that in all jest, I say that, but there's an element of truth in it. And those of us who love cemeteries, we understand that there's more than just monuments here. It's more than just cleaning a monument so that you can read the name. It's being part of something that's much bigger than you are, part of a bigger